Hi guys, and welcome to the 9th edition of Talking Travel with me, Andrew. This is a weekly chat that goes out every Monday where we look at some of the travel issues in and around Southern Africa and answering some of your questions around traveling in the region. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter and keep up to date with all the latest blog posts and that sort of thing that come through on those feeds. From the blog this week, we had a look at visa requirements for a number of different countries. We had a look at Botswana, South Africa, Namibia, and we're going to have Zambia and Mozambique coming up on the blog for next week. We also had a look at a post which I put up when we came back from our trip to the Masai Mara earlier in the year. It's entitled 5 hours in the Masai Mara, and it's just a brief account on 5 hours on a morning drive in that region and just how the Mara delivers without fail. Then we also did a post on guidelines, tipping guidelines for Southern Africa. This is always a big question with a lot of guests come to the end of their trip and they're not too sure what to tip their guide or the tracker. So we've given you some guidelines on your guiding staff, polers in Botswana, and just general staff around the lodge and hotels. Then we've also got an amazing special running at the moment at Azanzi, where it's a package for a couple for a 7-night stay. One member of that couple gets their accommodation at half price. So massive savings on that side of things as well. Be sure to check that one out. Then in industry news, SAA have announced that they will be flying to Rwanda and to Burundi. So from the 17th of January 2012, there will be a flight that will go from Johannesburg to Kigali and then onwards to Bujumbura. So gorilla trekking is a major draw card in this Rwanda region, and it's going to be very interesting to see how these scheduled flights will now affect travel and tourism to Uganda, which has been one of the preferred destinations in terms of ease of access. So those flights will start from the 17th of January in 2012. Then industry news as well, Robin Pope Safaris, a very interesting post on Facebook this week. The Lunga Lagoon is apparently been visited by massive herds of elephant and buffalo. The numbers here, they're talking up to 800 odd buffalo and herds of 60 to 100 elephant at a time. So now at the peak of the dry season, leading up to when the rains is going to start to fall now, these animals come down in huge numbers to the last little bit of remaining water in that region. So incredible sightings coming out of the South Luangwa area in Zambia. On the poll this week, we looked at the benefits of national parks versus private safari lodges, and we got some very interesting results. The first question that we asked was around the benefits of private lodges versus national parks, and 58% of you guys voted that the biggest pro is being able to venture off-road, which is without a doubt a massive positive side of being at a private lodge. 25% of you reckon that the fact that sightings were limited to 3 vehicles at a time is a major draw card as well. And it's quite right. When you pull into a sighting at a national park, you could have up to 50, 100 vehicles there, depending on the time of year that you go. But in the private reserves, sightings are always restricted to a maximum of 3 vehicles at a time. That's to give guests exclusivity, but then also to just give the animals a little bit of a wide berth and not put that additional pressure onto them. Then 15% reckon that privacy at the actual lodge itself was one of the factors that they took into account when deciding between national parks or private safari lodges. Then when we looked at the benefits of national parks, we got some very interesting results as well. 82% of you guys voted for flexibility to spend the whole day in the park, which is a big thing. You can head out first thing in the morning and come back late in the afternoon, whereas at private safari lodges, you've got scheduled drives in the mornings and afternoons. Then 9% each for the fact that national parks are always family friendly, whereas some of the private reserves have age restrictions on their game drives. And then the other 9% say that it doesn't break the budget. So I thought budget was going to be a far bigger determining factor in the whole thing, but it doesn't seem to play that big a role. So this week, in case you hadn't guessed it, we're going to look at some of the benefits. We're going to look at comparing private nature reserves to visiting national parks. So check it out in this week's feature. Right, so inevitably cost is a major factor when you decide on whatever holiday you're going to do. For most people, budget is the primary determinant factor when they look at where they can go, what they can afford to do. So obviously, when you look at a 5-star lodge, the costs are going to be far greater than if you were to go to a national park and make use of the National Parks Board accommodation. This is not always true at the moment. Some of the lodges are running fantastic deals where you can get last-minute getaways. If you book within 7 days of travel, you get massively reduced rates. So that's something to be aware of if you're trying to get the most out of your budget. But in general, private lodges are far more expensive than going to the National Parks Board accommodations and camps. The biggest side of this comparison would be around the experience. What you're going to get when you go to a private safari lodge versus what you would get if you were to do a national park. So the first thing is, on the experience side, is that in a private reserve you will be in an open vehicle. So for example, in Madikwe Game Reserve, no private vehicles are allowed to drive through the reserve unless you're going straight to the lodge. Whenever you head out on a game drive, you will be accompanied by a qualified guide in an open game drive vehicle. So it gives you great view. You've got the sense of the air rushing through your hair. You're on the back of the vehicle. You actually feel like you're really in the wild. If you're going to be going into a national park on the other side, you're not allowed to even get out of your vehicle unless it's at a designated area like a picnic spot. So depending on the size of the vehicle that you've got, if you've got a family of 5 and you want to go away in a hatchback, could be a very, very interesting journey for you. Then the other side of things is that obviously at the private lodges, all of the guides are in radio contact with one another. So again, using Madikwe as an example, 30 lodges out there with all the vehicles out, you've got an extra couple of 100 eyes looking for the game for you. So if someone finds, for example, a wild dog, a pack of wild dogs on a kill, they can radio that in, the other guides will be notified about that. So your chances of actually finding and seeing these shy and secretive creatures increase dramatically when you go to a private lodge. The guides are also based in the area and are driving that section day in and day out. So they know exactly, or they've got a rough idea on where to find these animals. So if you're driving into a national park, for example, you're almost going in blind. And if you're a foreigner doing a self-drive, then even more so. Obviously you can stick to the main roads, and some of the sightings boards that are put up at the camps also help you to identify where the game has been found, but it's never an exact science. Off-roading, this was a big thing when we did the poll on Facebook, and the ability to go off-road at a sighting, it just adds a whole new dimension to the experience. So for those of you who don't know what off-roading entails, in a national park, for example, you can be driving along the main road and you can see a pride of lions that are walking alongside the road, and as you get there they start to veer off and they walk 100 meters into the bush and they lay down underneath a nice green shady tree. That's the end of your sighting. If they lie down flat in that grass, you're probably not going to see much more than the odd ear flick or a tail flick. Now if you're in a private reserve in that exact same situation, your guide would be able to venture off-road and follow those lines as they move towards the tree and then stop adjacent to them whilst they rest. So all of a sudden what was a great sighting and then dissipated into just a fleeting glimpse can now become a far better sighting. And if you start to look at that in terms of being able to follow animals that are on the hunt, it opens up a whole new avenue for you when you're out there traveling. Then the other side of things is that sightings in private nature reserves are limited to a certain number of vehicles in a sighting at any one time. Most reserves have a guideline of 3 vehicles per sighting. So that means that no more than 3 vehicles will be allowed into that sighting. Even though there's 10 other vehicles wanting to get in there, they have to take a standby position and wait for their turn before moving into the sighting. On the flip side, in a national park, worst case scenario, if you were to look at something like Pilanesberg or Kruger National Park, during the Easter season, if you find a pride of lions that are fairly close to the road and are in good visibility, you're going to have anywhere from 50 to 100 vehicles sitting around there all jostling for position. So it can become quite stressful at times, and my personal take on the whole thing is if I'm on a main road and I come across a massive sighting like that, I don't even bother. I just try and get right past that traffic jam and I'll go and find my own game somewhere. More often than not, it's vehicles sitting there waiting for an animal to stand up and get that fleeting glimpse again. It's not worth it. Game drive times and flexibility. This is where the national parks win. In private reserves, morning and afternoon drives are the standard. During winter, sometimes they'll do a day drive, but that's more an exception to the rule. Morning drives, heading out after a nice cup of tea and biscuits at the lodge. You go out for about 3.5 to 4 hours, come back to the lodge during the day where you rest and chill around the pool. And then again in the late afternoon, you'll head out on a game drive for your evening drive. These drives usually extend after dark with your guide using a spotlight to try and find some of the nocturnal species in the region. On the flip side, in national parks, gates usually open from sunrise and close again at sunset. Those are the only times that you're allowed into the park. If you come back after dark, more often than not, you get fined for being late and could even find yourself being expelled from the reserve. Where the national parks do win is that you can leave as the gates open and come back later in the evening. So it allows you to do a packed lunch, a couple of drinks and that sort of thing, and head out for a full day's worth of game viewing. This is often the best way to do it during winter, where you can find a nice water hole and spend the whole afternoon sitting there waiting for the game to come down to you rather than you going in search of the game. So that's something to remember, and that's where national parks does beat private reserves hands down. Yeah, let's see what else we've got here. Which is better? Again, like I said earlier, it comes down to budget and what your purpose is. For a lot of people visiting South Africa for the first time, I would say that going to a private reserve, a private lodge, is the way to do it. Whether you do it in conjunction with a self-drive package to a Pilanesberg or to a Kruger National Park, for example, is up to you. If your budget allows for it, then I would highly recommend doing something like that. Spending a couple of days in Kruger National Park, experiencing it from a South African point of view, doing it self-drive, and then perhaps looking at spending 2 nights at a private safari lodge in the region, just to complement your experience, give you a little bit of luxury before you head back home, and then also just to increase your chances of seeing some of the species that you might not have been able to find in the Kruger National Park for itself. These private safari lodges around that area, you know, like I said earlier, the guides know where the animals are, and on a 2-night stay, I'd be very surprised if you weren't lucky enough to see the big 5 in one of these areas. Seeing the big 5 in Kruger, depending on your luck, can take you a couple of days, up to 5 days, 7 days. All depends on your luck and how often you're able to spend time in the park itself. The last minute rates that we mentioned earlier are making some of the 5-star and private safari lodges more accessible for South Africans. But in general, I think the trend is that we look to go and do self-drive packages to some of the national parks. Accommodation is also a big difference between the two areas, and with the national parks you generally have accommodation ranging from tents all the way through to camping sites where you bring in all your own equipment, as well as chalets and self-catering blocks and units. So you've got the full range on offer, and these are definitely far more affordable than a private game reserve. So that's a brief look at it. We're going to go into more detail on the blog. I wanted to keep this nice and short and give you an overview. I didn't feel that splitting it up into 2 chats would give you the all-round perspective that I'm hoping that this has given you now, but I haven't been able to go into as much detail as I would have liked. So what I'll do is I'll elaborate on some of these thoughts and my train of thought in the blog in the upcoming week. But for next week's chat, and for the poll on Facebook, we want to look at some of your favorite adventure activities. What are the things that you like to do when you head out on a holiday? Is it mountain biking? Is it bungee jumping? Is it hiking? What is it? We'd like to know. And then during the week, we're going to start to look at some of the features that we can put together for the chat for next week, and put together some of the adventure tips and planning your trip to South Africa. So that's it from me from this week. We'll see you guys next week. Cheers.